Alright, so Arrival's one of those movies that I think will stick with people long after they watch it. Dealing in hard science concepts, this altered the landscape of alien movies much in the same way that Close Encounters of the Third Kind did. Whereas in the past we'd had films about aliens attacking Earth and blowing up the White House, here Arrival does things differently to tell a human story about life, love and loss. Throughout this video, we're going to be breaking down the entire film, its ending, and also talking about the hidden details and things you missed in it. Before touching on the movie though, I feel like we have to talk about the short story that the entire thing's based on. Titled Story of Your Life, this work by Ted Chiang deals with inevitability set at the backdrop of theoretical physics. Ted went to see the play Time Flies When You're Alive, and this centers around a man having to deal with the notion that his wife's dying of breast cancer. At this point, Ted came up with the idea to tell a story about a mother who had a daughter well aware that the daughter was going to die. Now, the short story is roughly 50 pages long, and it's packed with diagrams of sunbeams and also how light travels. It's very complicated and in-depth, discussing how predestination works within the ideas of free will. In this story, there's a line that discusses how a ray of light has to know where it will end up at, so that it can choose the point in which it fires off from. There's very much this idea in space travel that you choose the destination and then travel towards it, and thus all that's in between is already predetermined and unchangeable. This is something that the film deals with too, and in it we follow linguist Dr. Louise Banks as she's put in charge of attempting to communicate with aliens known as heptapods. When we create languages and sentence structures, we often take letters, place them together, and then make the words which we then combine to form a sentence so that we can get our point across. Thus we move very much in a manner of point A to point B. Where the heptapods differ though is that they don't really speak in sentences, and instead they form the entire idea and concept, which is then presented in a circular looking image. Because of this, they have completely different ways of viewing reality, and thus they're able to see all time at once, pulling together both the past, present and future into one cohesive moment. Now Louise does this too, and throughout the film we get what are seemingly flashbacks of her daughter who died at a very young age. However, this is actually revealed to be the future, with Louise seeing her daughter's untimely death. In the original work, she died when she was in her mid-20s during an accident, but here they make it even more heartbreaking by having her pass away as a child. Now, Ted Chiang has given numerous interviews about the movie in which he's discussed the Big Bang, entropy, and how time moves in general. There are theories that due to the Big Bang that everything's already predetermined because the entire universe set out from this one point, and then it travelled in set directions, thus creating set outcomes. The TV show devs did a great job of explaining this, and they used the example of rolling a pen on a table. It said that if you roll it backwards, then that very much represents the past and the journey that it's been on. If you roll it forward, we know what direction it will go in because of where it set out from, and thus we can predict the future and determine where it will end up before it does. Applying this to a grand scale means that everything's path can be predicted because we know where it starts out from, and thus this cause and effect is all predetermined. There's even ideas in science that we only remember things because of the Big Bang, and we're able to think back to prior moments because it all originates from this point. The notes we hear are the same forwards and backwards, so if you play the music reversed, it still all sounds the same. Titled On the Nature of Daylight, we can't play this song in the video for copyright reasons, but the entire thing can be found both forwards and backwards on the internet from official channels. Now even Louise's first and last words to her daughter are exactly the same.
Come back to me. Come back to me. Come back to me. Baby, come back to me.
Her name is also Hannah, and Hannah itself is of course a palindrome. Lots of timey-wimey wibbly-wobbly stuff that I want to talk about more as we get further in, and I hope you're enjoying the video so far, and if you are, please hit that thumbs up button. Now in the short story, they do something different to the film, and that has Louise actually been able to change the events of the future. However, she goes against this and still decides to live out the life with her child, knowing that it's doomed to end the way that it does. This is different to the movie, as I never really got the feeling that she has a choice, and instead she's living out the days knowing that there's gonna be good and bad ones. Either way, I think there's definitely a lot of beauty in this, as she's still accepting her life and spending the short time that she has with her daughter because it's gonna bring so much happiness. I've just had kids myself, and I wouldn't trade the time I've had with them for anything else, which I think is very much reflected in Louise. She knows that life is precious and that just because something is short, it doesn't mean that it means nothing. Now I think this is very much the opposite ideology to her husband Ian, who's played by Jeremy Renner. The pair meet on the mission with the heptapods, and he can't deal with the fact that she still had a child knowing that they would die one day because of the pain it would cause. I know some people that simply won't get a dog because they've already had one that they ended up losing. It's so heartbreaking, and the pain for Ian has him wishing that she was never born in the first place. If it never happened, he could have been spared the fate of losing his daughter, which is described as being the worst thing that a parent can go through. He sees it as a loss, whereas Louise sees it as a gain, even though Hannah's life was very brief. Now, in the opening of the movie, we pan down from the lines of the ceiling in Louise's home. This is a shot that's later mirrored at the 52-minute mark when we pan up from the ship's floor. When crafting the sets of Arrival, the creative team deliberately put markings in the ceilings, and this can be seen in the classroom and also on the ship. When discussing why this was done, Denis Villeneuve stated that he wanted these to all resemble each other, and that the three settings could very much dictate the past, present, and future. As we pan down, we see a giant window, and later on in the movie, Louise stands in front of this. The director shot this with the idea that we would also see repeated imagery in this, and later on we get a similar shot on the ship. The window itself is meant to mirror the divide between the heptapods and Louise, and even the trees in the background are supposed to be similar to the creatures. Now, this environment creates some familiarity between her home and the ship, and when creating a dialogue between different languages, familiar environments are often used as a way to find common ground. We cut to Louise holding her child for the first time, and this is reflected in the moments in which we see her in the same hospital holding her for the final one. Cut to the pair playing out on some grass, and Louise moves her fingers to resemble the heptapods, whilst her daughter also has a horse costume that makes her look like she's riding one. This was done deliberately, as there's 8 legs in total, reflecting how the creatures themselves carry this too. Now, the heptapods themselves are covered in a thick fog, and due to us not really being able to see where they come from, they do look like hands sticking down through the smoke. It's almost like they're connected to arms in a body that we can't see the face of. I've always thought this was meant to make them act almost like the hands of God. To me, they kinda look like the aliens from The Simpsons, but we'll not get into that. Now, Denis Villeneuve also wanted to give them a look like the Grim Reaper, which would make humanity fear that they've brought death with them. In the source material, they were called Raspberry and Flapper, whereas in the film, they're called Abbott and Costello. These comedians did the Who's On First sketch, which centered around two people that constantly miscommunicated with each other, similar to what we see in the movie. Abid is later killed, and we rarely see him interacting with the humans because of this exact reason. However, the heptapods are very much a species based around unity and coming together for the greater good. This is why Abid doesn't mind sacrificing himself, though he of course worries about it. Abid shows up late just before his death, and he was likely preparing himself for it, which is why he turned up after Costello. Costello flies away, and this is because he has to be there for Louise in order to have the conversation with her after the event plays out. In the movie, the military actually state that the pair aren't communicating with each other, and they wouldn't need to be because they already know the past and future. They are very much all together as one, and even their mission is to bring humanity together through a universal language that will make us see life differently. They want us to do this so that in 3,000 years they can return and we can help them out. The entire movie is about coming together. You also see Hannah's life, including all the ups and downs.
I love you. I hate you!
Now we see the scene in which the lump is found, and even though Louise knows this, it's still heartbreaking because the moment is finally upon her. Hannah's death is inevitable, and we see it playing out before we catch up to Louise walking down a circular corridor. This was deliberately chosen to match the idea that time is cyclical, and circular things are something that repeats throughout the movie. The language is of course presented using circles, and with time no longer being something with a beginning, middle and end, it instead loops around. The future affects the past just as much as the past affects the future, and the line that follows this even touches upon it.
But now I'm not so sure I believe in beginnings and endings.
Preceding this, we can also hear Louise saying,
And this was the end.
Now, though this shot happens early on in the movie, this is actually the last scene in terms of the story if it's being told in chronological order. It's all sort of looping around, which is shown here. Now, this circular location is later mirrored when Louise meets General Shang. He gives information that she needs to use in the past, and this all happens at the Place des Arts in Montreal, which is also circular. Here Louise also wears circular spiral earrings, again tying into this notion. Denis also wanted to make the heptapod ship circular, but they felt it was a bit too on the nose, so they elongated it to make it like a contact lens. This is actually also based on an asteroid as well, which is why it has a stone surface. Now, even the music itself is based around the circle of fifths and an interval known as the perfect fifth. This is created by placing multiple fifths together, and in the end it gives you a cyclical melody. Now, Louise looks depressed and lonely when we first see her, which I think we're meant to assume is because of her daughter's death. However, we learn that she's okay and is probably just looking down because she saw Jared posted a video or something. And this is the day that the heptapods arrived, and we learn that 12 showed up on the planet at key locations. I'm sorry, Jared. I love you really. Now, in the short story, there was 112, I think. Right, and I might be reaching, but I think they chose 12 for a reason. The movie is obviously dealing with time, and clocks have 12 points on them, which also forms a circle. Might be reading into that, but the school is evacuated and humanity is sent into a panic. Louise quickly rushes out of the room, leaving the TV on. In a nice bit of continuity, she returns the next day and is still out in the open because she never had time to close it. The heptapods are meant to bring us together, but it's actually pushed us apart due to the world being divided. Nations all refuse to speak to each other. I love how this idea of communication, or lack thereof, something lays throughout every aspect of the film. Not only do we see this in the heptapods and Louise, but we also see it between Louise and Ian when she refuses to tell them about Hannah. Now on the news we see a report from Montana in which the reporter says this.
8 hours after landing, there's still no signs of what might be called first contact.
Might be a reach, but this was the site of first contact in Star Trek First Contact. Now, the ships never touched down on Earth, and this was done for a specific reason. Denny acknowledged some might find it weird they travelled trillions of light years but never landed. However, they wanted humanity to make the final steps themselves. This is why they float in the air, and why we very much have to go to them. The military then come in with Colonel Weber, who's played by Forrest Whitaker. Due to working on insurgents in the war in the Middle East, Louise has top-level clearance, and he needs her because she's the
best of the best of the best, sir!
He plays a tape of someone talking back and forth with the heptapods, and later on we see a body being wheeled out when she makes it to the base. This was likely the previous translator, and this is why Weber says,
"You're better than the last guy."
Now, screenwriter Eric Heisera was also working on Bird Box at the time, and huge shoutouts to the Now Playing podcast for saying that he might have used ideas from that, in that the planet's swarmed by things that overwhelm the human mind so much that people can't comprehend looking at them, which may be something that's too mirrored in how he dies with the heptapods.
Who's being carted off in the medevac?
Not everyone is able to process experiences like this.
So judging by that, he likely had the same dreams that we see Louise having when she started to understand the language. He'd see his own death, know it was fast approaching, and thus in turn it would likely lead to his own death. Now, scientists have discovered that learning a new language literally rewires the brain to think certain ways, and with the heptapods it allows Louise to see her entire life. It completely alters her perspective of time, and it goes from being linear to non-linear, so things like the past, present and future no longer exist. If you've seen Watchmen, then you basically become like Dr. Manhattan, which means that Louise can see her daughter again, but it would have to be in the past, which is why she says, "Come back to me." However, in the moment of her death, it's still extremely heartbreaking, and there comes with it this grief that Hannah can't experience time like she can, so she's truly gone. It's said that once you dream in another language, that you start to truly understand it, and the movie's littered with longer, more thoroughly detailed visions of Hannah as Louise starts to comprehend it more. Eric also stated that originally the aliens were going to give us blueprints for an interstellar ship, but after seeing Christopher Nolan's movie, he decided to change things up. Also, breakdown of Interstellar on the channel right now. And we learn Weber's going to another translator and she says,
Before you commit to him, ask him the Sanskrit word for war and its translation.
He later shows up and says that he said the word meant an argument, whereas Louise says that it actually means a desire for more cows. This is a throwaway line, but it actually has a lot of importance later on. The word tool gets miscommunicated, and thus people think that the heptapods are talking about weapons. One could view war as an argument, whilst another could view it as a desire for more cows, and this language is very dependent on context and also intent. China almost starts a war because humanity gets a word, and this could be interpreted as meaning a weapon. This is later expanded to say, there is no time, use weapon, which is taken as a threat. However, the word weapon in context is the main key thing here. They're saying there's no time because they don't view time as a thing, and they're attempting to pass on this knowledge to humanity, so use weapon becomes use the tool. This is the tool of language that they're trying to teach, and it shows how one little thing can spiral out of control. Also interesting to see Russia and China making allegiances on the TV. Maybe history just repeats itself and we're all going through the motions. Anyway, Weber picks up Louise in a helicopter, which is where she meets her future husband. Again, there's this idea of miscommunication, as she doesn't have headphones on when he first speaks, and thus she can't hear him. When she puts them on, he says,
Well, the cornerstone of civilization isn't language, it's science.
Now, he basically disagrees with everything in her book that says language is the first thing we should develop. However, the entire headphone thing that happened moments before completely disproves this. Language is what he tried to use to speak to Louise first, and then science was brought in through the technology in the headphones. Now they approach the ship, and I love this shot with the clouds rolling in. The CGI in this film's astounding, especially for the $50 million budget that it had, and nothing feels wrong or out of place. Instead, it all crafts this world in order to give us the idea that something like this could happen tomorrow. Now, the look of the movie is actually inspired by the art of Martin Hovland Ingelow. This is dark and dreary, and he stated that he wanted the whole movie to feel like a damn Tuesday morning bus ride. Which, now you mention it, mate, I can see it. Now, normally in films dealing with aliens, the movie skips over language and just lets everyone understand everyone. This is normally done through Universal Translator, or in cases like Star Wars, characters like Han can already speak Huttese so he can understand Jabba. The movie really makes you think about how difficult it would actually be to try and start up a dialogue with an alien that had a completely different term of reference to what we have on Earth. Language is a massive barrier, and we've even seen in our own history how miscommunication has led to death in war. We watch as the English-speaking countries like Australia don't mind sharing information, but the ones where English isn't predominant definitely hold things back. Now they suit up and head to the ship, and we can see how clunky they are when Louise leaves the tent. The ship has lower gravity to our Earth, and when they're all on it, the hazmat suits are actually CGI. This was done so that the actors could act like they were in a lower gravity environment without the restrictions of movement that they'd normally provide. They touch the bottom of the ship, which is made out of stone, and to me this has been chosen for a specific reason. The phrase written in stone, of course, means that something can't be changed, whereas metal can be welded. This structure gives the idea that everything is unchangeable. They travel up into it, and in a nice bit of detail, we can see the wrist devices moving from portrait to landscape mode. This is happening as the gravity reorientates around them so that they can walk on the walls or the floors. Now they place a bird on the ground, and this was a practice carried out by coal miners, which led to the phrase "a canary in a coal mine." Dangerous gases like carbon monoxide would kill the canary quite quickly, and thus this would let miners know that they had to leave the area immediately. They end up going back, and as Donnelly takes off his suit, we can see it almost forming a yin and yang symbol. Yin and yang is of course a circle that has circles within it, but it also has balance. This is a theme throughout the movie, with everything trying to act in harmony. At the hour 37 mark, we see Louise unpacking her book in the future. This also has a black and white circle on the cover, similar to a yin and yang symbol. Huge shoutouts to Makeshift Quilt on Reddit for spotting that, and from here we watch Louise obsessing over the language. The planet starts to destabilize, and we see on the news that looting's starting to happen across the entire world. Religious groups say that their arrival has ushered in the prophecy of the end of the world, and again, I'm going to take it back to this idea of miscommunication because the government aren't being transparent. Because of this, people can run wild with theory times. It leads to more panic and confusion. If the government would just speak to people, they'd quell the paranoia, but instead they don't, which causes people to live in fear. This is something that's of course reflected in the movie later on, with the word weapon causing a rogue faction of humans to attack. This also happened in Contact as well, which I think that this movie has taken some inspiration from. Using a whiteboard, Louise tells them the word for human, and they create their own response on their own whiteboard. However, Weber is worried that this might not be helping, and Louise tells him the story of James Cook and when he went to Australia. They pointed at an animal to ask what it was, and the Aborigines replied by saying kangaroo. It was only later they learned that this meant I don't know, and this idea of misunderstanding is of course reflected in the term weapon. Now it's a great story, but as Louise says, it's made up. It was in the short story though, and I view its inclusion to show how language can be used to manipulate other people. Weber says we all know what happened to the Aborigines, and it's clear that the story might actually push him into the corner to fear what's going on. Now in case you don't know, that could very much be a hidden invasion going on in the film. That takes us into theory time. Theory time is hidden invasion time. A theory in the movie might not be true. Now Reddit, bloody Reddit, I've seen on there from a user that this might actually be an alien invasion hidden under our nose. When we look at our own history, there's been several times where Britons entered a country, propped up their language and religion, and they've become the ruling power. This is very much what the heptapods are doing, and they're showing us a completely new way of thinking that replaces our own. This would change our language and way of being, and I've even seen discussions that this could be a metaphor for communism, with them making everyone a collective. This takes away their individuality, and though I don't think that's the intention of the film at all, I do think that's an interpretation that's worth going over. Anyway, shut up, just shut up, and that's the end of theory time. Huey time. Anyway, we learn China is viewing the ships as hostile and that they've launched warships. This is led by General Shang, who Louise ends up speaking to later on. In the future, she learns of what his wife said to him on her deathbed, and in the past, she uses this when calling him to get him to listen. This shows how the future has an impact on the past, and it's through this new way of seeing things that she can save us. There's Abid and Costello, Louise and Hannah, and of course the General and his wife. Death is something that unites us all, and it's through this that we're able to appreciate life and avoid death at all costs. Louise writes on the whiteboard to explain what question they want to pose, and she's very much using this as a concept to explain to Weber, much like how she does to the aliens. I love this repetition of every side having breakdowns in language, and it adds so much depth to the movie. Louise ends up taking the suit off and risking the atmosphere in order to speak to the aliens directly, and this furthers the communication. After doing this, she has her first vision of Hannah, showing how immersing yourself in a language can get you to think differently. Later on, Louise steps into a vessel. This takes her behind the glass located in the ship. This exposes her directly to the heptapod's atmosphere, and there is a throwaway line in the movie about radiation levels. She coughs upon entering, and it's probably not a safe environment for a human to be in. When looking over theories for the film, I've seen some state that this could end up being what causes the cancer in her child, but it's a sacrifice Louise has to do in order to bridge the gap between the species. We see a soldier on the phone speaking to his partner, and she's clearly panicking that the aliens are going to kill them. He says things like, "You don't need to worry," but this isn't enough, and it demonstrates the panic that exists. Again, there's this breakdown in communication which causes people's minds to wander. He himself also isn't being told anything, and later on we see several news reports and YouTube videos grifting about misinformation. This is to get people angry, and look, we've all lived through the last 2 years, and I think the movie's clearly pointing out that in times of not knowing, there will be those that see an opportunity to build an audience and thus make money. This later inspires a soldier to attack the ship, showing how people that do this cause real-world consequences by spreading ignorance and fear. The movie doesn't pick sides though, and instead it says both the mainstream media and independent ones can be used to stoke division, which is why you should subscribe to the Kevin Spoilers show. Shabow!
If they're scientists, they don't seem to ask a lot of questions.
Obviously, this is because they already know everything and therefore don't need to learn anything from us. We then get a shot of the 12 locations where they've shown up. The last one is of Hokkaido, which could be a reference to Contact. In that we discovered there was a secret launch site after the first one was destroyed, which allowed humanity to continue its journey into the stars.
Spoiler alert.
We see that code is used to decipher the language, and this is a real-world program called Wolfram Mathematica. It allows for machine learning and complex symbols to be created, which studies a language. The movie version has been changed slightly so it can perform what's being shown on screen, and these parts were actually written by Christopher Wolfram, who is the code creator's son. The language is a palindrome as well, and it's the same forward as it is backwards. They know the entire concept and idea that they want to present, and how much space it needs to occupy, and thus they're able to show it to us. We then get a flash of Hannah discussing her parents, and she's done a drawing of them talking to animals. This is the first clue that she's in the future, with the animals of course representing the aliens. We later see this picture in full with it having a canary in a cage, and the animals being made out of Play-Doh to represent the heptapods. She then has a vision of a heptapod standing in the corner of a room. Might be a reach, but this also reminded me a lot of the spider shot that's in Denis' film Enemy. Now we discover that a game is being used to converse with the heptapods, and this is in places that are beginning to view them as enemies. Games are of course competitive, and thus they create divides with both winners and losers. The heptapods are about coming together, but games are the opposite to this, and thus this is why these sides end up escalating their feelings to attack. Louise and Ian then end up heading on board the ship, but the explosive has already been planted. Abid has to remain behind so he can force the pair out, and thus he sacrifices himself for the greater good. Louise and Ian are saved, and in his final moments, Abid leaves behind thousands of spirals that carry a lot of information with them. This contains everything they know or will ever know, and though it will take years to decipher, it's enough to ensure humanity will live for another 3,000 years without destroying itself. The ship ascends further into the sky, and China escalate their threats to say that if the aliens don't leave within 24 hours, that they're gonna be fired upon. Communications between nations has ceased, and it seems like we're all doomed. We get another flash forward of Hannah, who asks her mother to explain what a win-win situation is using scientific terms. She says,
If you want science, call your father.
Now Ian is obviously a scientist, hinting at the reveal later on. Now he studied the message and also measured it, and it divides perfectly into 1/12. All of the ships have their own messages that will come together, but humanity has to work as a whole in order to unlock it all. She says that in order to get everyone to work together, that the US should give up their knowledge first, which Ian says is a non-zero sum game. This ties back to the win-win scene, and Louise uses this term in the future to tell Hannah the correct phrase.
Non-zero sum game.
That's it. Yeah.
This was of course told to her by Ian, who is Hannah's father, showing how he was the one who could describe it using scientific phrasing. The aliens then send out their own vessel, which Louise goes into. This is her finally seeing the creatures, and the smoke itself was also its own form of miscommunication, as we couldn't fully see them. This created barriers between the two sides, but here Louise gets to have a face-to-face conversation. She asks questions like who is Hannah, and finally learns the truth. She's dropped back on Earth, and we get another flash of her daughter. She asks why her father left, and we learn that Louise told him about her incoming death. Ian views her as making the wrong choice, and to him, he'd rather avoid the pain at all costs. The ships then change position, and the countries start to mount their military. We get flashes of Louise's book in which she's understood the language, and we can see her teaching this in the future. Louise is told by Weber that it's over, and they're lifting off in 5 minutes. Finally, she realizes what she has to do, and in the future, we see her at a gala. This has a heptapod's flag hanging up alongside the other nations, showing how we've all united together. Now their flag is a black and white circle, which again ties into the notions of yin and yang. There are no shades of grey because everything is clear and all is known instead of there being different interpretations. She speaks with General Shang, who tells her that she reached out to him on his private number. Louise doesn't know what he's talking about, but he shows her his phone and then confirms that she called him, which she then goes and does in the past. He tells her the last words his wife said to him, which he kept to himself. Again, timey-wimey wibbly, you know by now. And when she calls him, this de-escalates everything, and the ships seem to vanish in the thin air, which the humans can't understand. However, these are fourth-dimensional beings that don't perceive time in the same way that we do. Because of this, they can travel back and forth between what we're unable to perceive. Therefore, they don't really disappear, they just move through time, and they're no longer in the position that they were when we could first see them. For example, if you leave a football outside for a month, it was in that position for a month. However, if you move it in the next month, it's now gone from that position. The person that you were the month prior wouldn't have been able to perceive this movement though, because it hasn't happened yet from their perspective. It does change position eventually though, and if viewed in a non-linear fashion, we can understand where it eventually went to. And we once more get a repeat of the start of the movie, with us panning down from the ceiling of Louise's home. She pours out a wine glass, and in the shot at the start of the movie, we could see two, which was one for her and one for Ian. She says that the day the ships left was the day Hannah's story began, and we see a blossoming romance between her and Ian back in Montana. In the future, she walks to the window and we catch Ian out on the grass. Louise ends up knocking on it to communicate with him, and this is also something that the heptapods did. Now at this point, Louise decides to embrace both the good and bad. Like the ray of light that knows where it wants to go, she knows what she has to go through to get there and the end of the journey. She accepts her life for all that it is and decides to embrace it instead of fearing the loss. Ian says it wasn't meeting the heptapods that meant the most to him, and instead it was actually meeting Louise. Perhaps one day he might see why she did what she did, and though she knows the future will be painful, she wants to go through with it. She hugs him in both the past and present and says that she forgot how good it felt to be held by him. You can see the pain on her face, knowing what she's about to go through, and Ian asks her at her home if she wants to make a baby. It's going to tear her heart out having to lose Hannah, but in the end, she still wants to do it. The movie closes out with her saying yes.
Yes. Yeah.
And if that doesn't have you tearing up, then I don't know what will. And that closes out both the movie and our breakdown, and I hope you enjoyed going back through it. I'd of course love to hear your thoughts on it, and if there's anything we missed, then make sure you leave it below. Huge thank you for all your support on these older movie breakdowns, and if you want something else to watch, then make sure you check out our one for Shutter Island. There's so many layers to the film, and we go through them all bit by bit to talk about why it works so well. That will be linked on screen right now, and with that out of the way, I've been Paul, you've been the best, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Peace.